Greetings. This is our very first lecture on chapter 1 of the book. And I'll be using edition 2, even though it's an older edition. It's most of the editions have the same information about research in them. The chapters may be in a different order, but I think it's okay if you order an older edition. The first thing that I'd like to talk about is why. Why are you taking a class on research when you're going to be practicing either school counseling or clinical mental health counseling? Well, for your purposes, your immediate purposes, there's a few different reasons. I think the most applicable reason is that there's many times that I've received a client and done an assessment and made a diagnosis, and I had never treated that diagnosis before. Our diagnosis class, the course that you'll be taking, is really just a foundational course. It gives you an overview of diagnosing, assessment, treatment. However, when you're in practicum, clinical field, working, or even with a private practice, you should have supervision, but you should also be able to do some practical research, and so that you may find the best ways to help your client. Maybe there are some new theories or applications or techniques that have just been published that may be beneficial to your clients. So the most important reason for this course is for you to be really prepared and understand ways to find out best practices to meet the needs of your clients. There are some other practical reasons. When you do research, you should be able to critically examine the research articles or books that you read. So not everything that's published is fantastic. And we're going to be able to learn how to look at a journal article or to look at a book chapter on a certain subject and to tell through critical examination whether that was a good study or not. So you'll be able to read the basic results and statistics and interpret them and decide, is this a theory or a technique or a method that you'd like to use or not? Do you think it will help your clients or not? So another very practical reason for taking this course is that it is a section on both the comps, your competency exam, which you need to take for graduation, and it's also a section on the NCE, the National Counseling Exam. And that is for your LPC. Because we are a CACREP accredited program, you may take the NCE before you graduate in your last semester with your comps. They're both put out by the same company. So I personally feel that if you're studying for one, you're kind of studying for both of them. So taking a combination of courses, the research course and our assessment course, you should have the basic knowledge to pass that section of the comps and the NCE. There are other reasons as well as these practical reasons. Perhaps you want to explore some new ideas or applications yourself. And this will help you to understand the methodology that you would need to follow, to do a literature review, to see what's already out there, to see what had good results and what had poor results, outcomes. And it will help you actually write up whether it's a theory or to perform your own investigative research. This helps you to give back to the field of counseling. I remember when I was a school counselor, and maybe I came up with some unique ideas for classroom counseling or counseling in the school system, or maybe in my private practice, some unique techniques or new techniques. I wanted to share them with other counselors, and I wanted to learn from other counselors in the field. So I would go to state and national conferences, and I would both present to others and I would learn from others. And I think each of you will have the ability to do that as well. The first chapter in our book is not a long chapter, and I also provided my notes on D2L that you can reference on your own. You can use them as a study guide. But I highlighted some things in this very first chapter that I think it's important for you to both pay attention to and memorize yourself. So the first thing that I think you need to understand are the 4 different types of knowledge, and these various types of knowledge can be clearly linked to certain research approaches. So there's 4 research approaches. I'm going to try to explain and give you some examples of each one. The first one is the descriptive approach. When I was in my master's degree, I also had a background in computer technology. Now, this was the very first time they came up with personal computers. So I started out in high school on an Apple IIe. It was the very first computer lab we had. And then I eventually got a job out of high school while I was in college at a computer store, the first computer store in our town. And I learned on an IBM XT. And then they trained me on how to build and repair customized computers, troubleshoot them. And then I moved into software, and eventually in my master's degree, I started working on some of the very early statistical programs. So the first one was called IBM Statistics, and the second one was called SPSS, and we still use SPSS today, along with a few other larger programs. But eventually, I became what's called a descriptive statistician. I would take all of these studies that my professors ran, and they would just give me all of the numbers, all of the results to their studies. I'd type them in. And these first computers were a little crazy. I would spend weeks just typing in these numbers on a numeric keypad. And once the numbers were in, I would decide, okay, well, what kind of statistics will come up with a graphical output, a pie chart, or a bar chart, or whatever, and what formulas should I use so that it would interpret the results of the study in a descriptive manner so that the reader could best understand the results of their studies. This is the most basic kind of statistician. I wasn't like, I couldn't get a job at ETS. My friends at ETS, they laugh at me. But it's some nice, it's some positive basic knowledge. So I would decide, okay, this is, the results I want to look at, how I want to look at them. So I would run a certain program, and maybe an ANOVA or something like that. And I'd press the button. I'd say, go, run the program. And I'd leave for dinner and sit around and eat dinner and have coffee with my friends. And I'd come back to my dorm room, and the computer would just be finishing the results. Sometimes we would even have to wait a little bit to get those results. So times have changed quite a bit. Now, Excel does a lot of this interpretation and graphical outcomes. It doesn't do the more complicated algorithms or formulas. So then in my last year of my program, my master's program, I got a new computer. I built a new computer. So the first one was the IBM XT. The second one was called an AT, a 286i. And I did the same thing. One of my professors gave me all of their data, spent a few weeks typing it all in. And then I hit enter, run, and I got up, and me and my friend were ready to go to dinner, and bam, it was done. And we were amazed at how quickly it had performed that function, those computations. It was a new world. We no longer had to wait. There was some instant statistical gratification. So in the book, it says that the key to descriptive knowledge is a focus on assessment, which allows descriptions of identified events to be made. So the key word for counselors is assessment. We may have a client, and we could give them an assessment, either an assessment measure, like a test, like the MMPI-2, something like that, or we could run our own assessment or a combination of those things. So now we will call it an intake assessment. And based on the diagnostic criteria, we would take the results, the information we gathered and observed in our assessment, and we would compare it to the criteria of the diagnosis in the DSM, and we would see what the best fit is. And we would be able to make an appropriate diagnosis based on the assessment. So That's a pretty good example for our very first one, descriptive. Okay, the second one is predictive. And it involves developing ways to predict identified outcomes. I don't like using the word itself in its definition. So predict, we want to identify the most probable outcomes. That definition, we're not using the word predict in the definition, but that's what it is. So a good example in education would be, how do you predict whether a student in high school is going to be successful in a high school program or in a certain branch or training program in the military or something like that. So the greatest predictor of college success is a combination of GPA and SAT. Those two things are the best predictors of college success for multiple reasons. Not because somebody is the most intelligent alone. It may be GPA takes into account many things like, does this person study? Do they do their homework? Do they show up for class? Are they good test takers? College is often an extension of the ways in which we learn K through 12. Not everybody is suited to this learning style. However, based on this particular learning style and teaching methodology and best student practices in that environment, GPA and SAT tend to be good predictors of success. Let's see. If we were going to look at counseling, we might want to predict which treatment methodology would give a successful outcome for our client. So would CBT be best used for this diagnosis? Would a different type of counseling, Gestalt, be more conducive to success with a specific diagnosis? And we can look that up, and we could look at studies that have used different theoretical methodologies, treatment methodologies, and with different diagnoses and populations. And we can see which were most successful, or maybe a combination of these methodologies were successful. So it takes away some of the guesswork, and it helps us provide the best treatment for our clients. All right, the third one is improvement. Improvement concerns the developing information designed to determine the effectiveness of interventions. For example, in education, might be wanting to know the effectiveness of mainstreaming students with disabilities. An example from counseling might be an interest in the effectiveness of a specific counseling approach. We might say, is that, how similar is that to predictive? Okay. And it is very similar. So let's differentiate that just a little bit. So as we think about our previous one, predictive, we might say that we want to choose what populations benefit from certain treatments. Okay, so the book uses the example of, maybe post-traumatic stress disorder population would benefit from a virtual reality technique, or maybe EMDR or something like that. Improvement measures the effectiveness of a treatment. So cognitive behavioral approach, for example, how effective is it with a post-traumatic stress population or clients? I think those two are very similar, but they do differentiate between the two in your book. I am used to kind of combining those two concepts into kind of like predictive effectiveness, basically, but here they separate them in your book. That's okay. Final type of research knowledge is explanation. And it says, typically researchers frame questions and problems in terms of theories or explanations of phenomena. For example, behavioral theory may be a basis for explaining a child's tantrum behavior in the reinforcement sequence developed within a particular environment. We can explain phenomena like events, or we could come up with theories and test those theories and see if they actually do explain psychological phenomena or events, or people's actions, what contributes to them. I just say that these 4 types because they're outlined specifically in this book. I do think, those predictive and basically effectiveness or improvement, how much has someone or something improved? I think they are very close, but they are separated in the book. Okay, so those are the 4 types. And the next thing is basically something I touched on in the introduction here. It's the practitioner scientist. And basically what that is each of you at the master's level, this is considered a terminal degree, especially once you get your LPC or your school counseling certificate, or both. It's considered a terminal degree. And at this level of education, you are expected to give back to the discipline in some way. So you will make personal discoveries. You'll find out what works best with certain types of clients or students or diagnoses or addictions or whatever you're working with, whatever population. And you may develop some of your own unique techniques. And it's important that you share them with other practitioners. Okay, let me give you an example of that. So it's not only in counseling. One time I took with another professor, I took a group of students to South Africa and to Pretoria, and we visited a lot of different agencies that were run by the Catholic Church at that time, and each one was treating, it was during the height of the AIDS epidemic, and they had very few resources, very little financing, but they were using some of the methods of healing or relieving symptomology. So for instance, if somebody was unable to eat because their stomach was upset, They could eat an herb or drink an herb, and that would settle their stomach, and they would be able to get some nutrition. Maybe they used a certain herb to boost immunity or up the white blood cell count or give them more energy, or maybe certain herbs had more vitamins. It's endless. But what we suggested was sharing all of these, I would call them home remedies, but it's really kind of like remedies that different villages or groups of people came up with over the years. Some of them were ancient. So I suggested that the nuns share all of these remedies, these natural remedies that they have found, in a newsletter that went out once a month with all of the other agencies throughout that country. And they could actually compile all of these remedies that would help combat the negative symptomology of HIV and AIDS. So no, it wouldn't cure HIV or AIDS, but it would help to treat the symptoms, the negative symptomology, until they could get some actual antibiotic cocktails and things like that, which at that time were very rare in that part of the world. So sharing that information could have helped and did help a lot of people. Let's see. You can read some things in this chapter about assumptions, but I just underlined a couple sentences here. The post-positivist approach, according to Gall, involves an assumption that individual perceptions of the social environment and an event influence how they behave. There's an interaction between the person's perception and the certain phenomena. This is a pretty straightforward concept that if something is observed, that object, person, germ, molecule, whatever it is influenced by the observer, no matter how cautious the observer is. When I was in school counseling, I would sit in a classroom to observe a child. My presence in the classroom influenced the way that child behaved, whether he or she knew I was there to observe him or her or not. So my presence would influence the results or outcomes of that observation. Same thing if I was out at recess, or my very presence influenced that. Now, scientists have observed this all the way down to the molecular level, the atomic level. But as far as counseling is concerned, our observation of an event or an individual influences the outcome of whatever we're trying, the phenomena, what the event, whatever we're trying to understand, to better understand. So we have to take that into account. Maybe my presence would result in a child acting out more or acting out less just by my observational presence. So it's just something to keep in mind. It's one of the key concepts, one of the key assumptions that may be on an exam. Okay, there are two sections that we are going to go over when we review the process of a literature review, the steps in a literature review, and the steps in your comprehensive final paper or article. So it says steps in the scientific process, and the next one is purpose of the overview of the text. These two match pretty well. So steps in the scientific process. We have to identify a problem, develop a hypothesis or research questions. And don't worry, we're going to go over each one of these individually, okay? This is just an outline. Develop the hypothesis or research questions. Number 5, so let's go through these again. Identify the problem, define the problem operationally, develop a hypothesis or research questions, identify and develop the research design, what procedures are we going to use, develop or identify techniques or instruments that can be used to gain the knowledge about the identified problem, collect the data, analyze the data, generate conclusions, and report. So we are going to go up to step 5. We're not going to do 6, 7, 8, or 9. We're not actually going to run these studies. We're going to come up with a problem. We're going to come up with hypotheses and research questions. We're going to come up with a research design. We're going to identify techniques and instruments that can be used to gain knowledge, but we're going to stop there. We're not going to actually run the actual study, okay? Now, in the next section, purpose of overview of the text, it talks about the sections of a journal article. And we're going to go over this when we go over our journal article as well. So it's going to have an introduction. Okay, we're going to identify the problem. It's going to review the literature. We're going to have a literature review, and it's going to define the problem operationally. Going to have a purpose statement, develop a hypothesis and research questions. We're going to have a methods section, identifying and developing research design procedures. What are those procedures? Identify the instruments, maybe the assessment instruments that we're going to use, and we're going to stop there. But it goes on to say, use the instruments, collect the data, analyze the results, and discuss those results. So you need to know all of these, but in our project, we're not actually going to run the studies. That is a very basic kind of introduction. But we're going to go through and learn about each one of these things step by step. Okay, if you have any questions, please email me. Thanks.